I found Rome a city of bricks, and left it a city of marble. Augustus Caesar. This is a video about the world of Game of Thrones. The Roman Empire was a crazy place, a massive united nation, its capital the world's largest city. The empire heralded in a new age of innovation and art, creating new technologies and ways of thought over the course of its history. And for all of its many faults, Rome was a majestic place. And you know what the craziest part is? It only lasted about 600 years. I mean, Rome was a thing for much longer before that, but it only really got going about 270 BCE, when it united the Italian peninsula. From there, it was able to conquer practically the entire Mediterranean by the year 0, and controlled a good continent's worth of people for the next 300 years. Now, if Rome was able to accomplish all that in only 600 years, what could you do with 5,000? A Song of Ice and Fire, more commonly known as Game of Thrones, is a fantasy series created by George R.R. Martin. Currently at over 4,000 pages long and continuing, it is one of the single largest fantasy stories around. And while I like a lot of the content, the world and the story makes zero sense. The world of Game of Thrones is divided into two main continents: Westeros, which is based on Western Europe, but more specifically the British Isles, and Essos, which is more broadly North Africa, and some parts of the Middle East, Southeast Europe, and the areas conquered by the Mongols. In Game of Thrones, there's a specific group of people called the First Men. They existed 8,000 years ago in Westeros, operating on a fairly low level of technology. They had kings, bronze tools, weapons and armor, and used leather shields. They created roads and built these Motte and Bailey forts to house their royalty. From this info, we can assume they were probably around a Bronze Age level of technology, similar to ancient Greece, Egypt, or Babylon. These innovations originally came about in the Levant in Southeast Europe around 3500 BCE, and then spread across Europe over the next 1,000 or so years. Great. So since they all have the same resources as real-world Britain did, they should probably reach a roughly medieval level of tech about 4,000 years later by real-life standards, right? Well, no, it ends up taking 8,000 years. For some reason, it takes twice as long for society to progress in Game of Thrones as in the real world. My bigger question, though, is not about Westeros, it's about Essos. They had Bronze Age tech all the way back in the super old days, during the Empire of Gis. This civilization was founded several thousand years before the Valyrian Freehold, over 8,000 years ago, and was using bronze weapons and armor when it first started. For some perspective, the oldest major civilization on Earth was in Babylon, about 6,000 years ago, and that was before even bronze was a thing. This was back when the wheel was a new technology. Anyway, they ruled over a huge area of land for thousands of years before eventually being taken down by Valyria with their dragons. This is where my problems begin, because soon after taking down Gis, Valyria became the authority on Essos, sort of like Rome in the real world, a giant empire that spans most of a continent. Except Essos and Europe are different sizes. Martin has mentioned before that Westeros is roughly the size of South America. And since the territory Valyria controlled in Essos is about twice that size, it would be about as big as Africa. So instead of being 5 million square kilometers like Rome was at its peak, old Valyria was about 30 million square kilometers, or about 6 times larger. Since Valyria is an analogy for Rome, I'll be using the population totals at the start of their empire for reference. During the 1st and 2nd centuries, it probably had about 65 million people. Multiplying this by land area, we can estimate that Valyria had a population of about 350 million, larger than the modern USA. Hell, that's larger than the population of fucking Earth in the year 0, since Rome had a way higher population density than most places. On top of that, Valyria lasted quite a while. For reference, Rome stuck around for about 1,200 years. China held strong for 2,100, occasionally breaking apart for civil war. These were both massive civilizations that accomplished a huge amount and controlled a very large area. So, how long did Valyria last? 5,000 years! So here's my question. How is it that an empire that spans the size of 3 Chinas, with more people than modern Mexico and Russia combined, that was united for longer than any country in the history of Earth, hasn't discovered gunpowder yet. Seriously, how? China figured it out around the year 1000 when it only had 60 million people and it only existed for 1.25 millennia. Meanwhile, Valyria over here had 4 times as much time and more people than planet Earth, and they haven't? They could get together all of the greatest scholars in a nation of 350 million over a period of 5,000 years to discover all sorts of different technologies, and yet they haven't figured out gunpowder or compasses or electricity or printing or democracy, like as a concept. For example, the Aztecs were only around for 100 years or so, and yet in that time, they managed to figure out calendars, aqueducts, canals, causeways, dams, city planning, chocolate, medicine that can help with muscle spasms, antibiotics, the abacus, and universal public education. In 1 century, Valyria was working with a practically infinite amount of resources in comparison, and yet 5,000 years later, and they're still using swords and longbows. They still can't print books, they've just been writing them by hand for 5,000 years. You'd think some noble somewhere would get his scholars together so he can print out a bunch of copies of a religious text or something, but no, that just doesn't happen. There are no stories of great inventors like Archimedes or Da Vinci, who figured out steam power or electricity or some new medicine. The closest you really get is Sam curing Jorah of his stone sickness. Hell, with Valyria's history, the people of Essos should be in fucking space right now. We did it in the real world, in less time. Besides Valyrian steel, there are no great inventions in Game of Thrones. It makes the world feel weirdly empty, like nothing ever happens besides what's on screen. So little is changed compared to what would make sense, that the world feels sort of dead. But there exists another problem in the world of Game of Thrones. Another problem of time and scale, and it begins with arguably the most important world building in the story, the royal houses themselves. These houses within the story are supposed to be ancient and glorious, stretching back thousands of years. It's cool. However, there exists a problem. The longest real living line of rulers is the Yamato family of Japan, a single dynasty that's been governing the islands for its entire ancient civilized history, aka 2,681 years. And keep in mind, it is very, very likely that that isn't true. The imperial family claims that the dynasty started back in 660 BC with Emperor Jimmu, but we can only actually trace back to 539 CE, over 1,000 years later. Plus, the legend goes that Emperor Jimmu was the great-grandson of the sun goddess Amaterasu, so I think we can rule out the Yamato as being legitimately that old. That's one of only 2 dynasties that even claims to be 2,000 years old in the real world, and it's one of only 8 that claims to be over 1,000. And how old is House Stark in Game of Thrones? 8,000 years old! Now, their own founding might be legendary as well, and to be fair, it seems like it is in the story. Their founder is a possibly mythical figure named Brandon the Builder, who supposedly raised their ancestral home of Winterfell. By the way, I was looking through the wiki page for House Stark, and there are a lot of Brandons. With the name being so common in 8,000 years of history, the one we see in the show is probably Brandon the 65th or something. Back on topic, I don't know if I would doubt their claims. They have living records of events that happened thousands of years ago, and many of them are quite accurate, so I wouldn't discount it being true. I mean, despite literally nobody having seen White Walkers for 8,000 years, the people in Game of Thrones still know of their existence, although many thought it to be a fairy tale. Even if the story of the Starks isn't 100% accurate, we can at least assume that there's some truth to it, considering this isn't just a thing with the Starks. A bunch of the ancient houses of Westeros claim to be 8,000 years old. The Starks, the Lannisters, the Oakharts, the Redwinds, the Fossaways, the Hightowers, the Bulwers, the Cranes, the Rowans, the Florents, the Peaks, the Tarleys, and a handful of others all claim to be descended from a legendary king who lived 8,000 years ago. That feels like a really odd thing to be just a coincidence. But what really brings it up as a problem is that most of the royal lines didn't end in that huge period of time. It's worth noting that the emperors of Japan only lived so long because For a huge period of Japan's existence, from 1185 to 1868, the nation was actually ruled by a series of military dictators called shoguns. They made all the laws, while the imperial family mostly spent their time making art and performing ceremonial duties. For almost 700 years, nobody really had a reason to depose them since they had no army and no claim to power. That's not true in Game of Thrones. There are constantly people scheming to assassinate each other, trying to take out entire families at a time. Arya kills most of the Freys. The Lannisters drop one by one until only Tyrion is left. The Targaryens almost completely die out, aside from arguably Jon Snow, and the Tyrells actually do completely die out, after a jealous Queen Cersei blows up the two heirs before killing the matriarch. These kinds of things were very common in both the series and real-world history, and I'm supposed to believe that all of these houses managed to survive for thousands of years? And what makes it worse is when people in the show constantly say that they've been allies for 1,000 years and things like that. This happens all the time in Season 7 when people are trying to debate the fate of the North. They say it what feels like once an episode. For some perspective, the longest military alliance in world history is between England and Portugal, and it's lasted 650 years. And the second longest one is between the US and Morocco, only 236 years, because they were both pissed off at the British. And rightfully so, I will say. A Stark claiming that they're the descendant of Brandon the Builder would be like the king of Kuwait going, "Oh yeah, I'm a direct descendant of the first emperors of Mesopotamia in an unbroken line of kings." Twice over. It's just a ridiculous claim to make. Look, I get it. George R. R. Martin really wants this grandiose story with these ancient lineages of kings and kingdoms going back to ancient times. Thousands of years of alliances, wars, empires, and glory. I understand. But it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. Controlling a large area of land with a high population means technological progress. The main empire of Valyria, which lasted for a frankly unrealistic length of time and covered an unbelievable area of land, never figured out printing, or electricity, or guns. Hell, it took them 8,000 years to figure out fucking ballista, which had been a thing in the real world since the BCs. And unless every royal in Westeros coordinated to fabricate an origin myth for a whole continent, the story just fall apart from being too big. Royal families end all of the time. Either the parents only had one heir who turned out to be celibate, or they all get disease and they die, or they all get assassinated, or they all just lose their seat of power. We even see this happening in the show on several occasions. It just doesn't make sense that so many of them can just dodge these bullets for thousands of years at a time. Ruling's a dangerous business. The main problem I have with the world of Game of Thrones is that it's just too fucking big. And since nothing ever seems to change except what happens on screen, it just feels empty. We get a bunch of revolutionary new acts in the show, like zombification and curing grayscale, but in terms of the history of the world, they're still working with a medieval understanding of medicine. The same families have been ruling since the dawn of human civilization. So little changes in the world of Game of Thrones that it just doesn't feel real. Thank you all for watching this video. I want to reiterate what I said at the start. I like Game of Thrones. I mean, I'm not a huge fanatic or a giant fan, but I like it. But this is just something I wanted to get off my chest about the world, and I feel like it's a problem in a lot of fantasy media, so I might go over it with some other stuff too. In particular, Lord of the Rings is another offender, although not quite as bad, because, I mean, most of the people in the world aren't human, so that kind of alleviates the problem. But yeah, please don't take this too seriously. It's just something that gets to me whenever someone in the show mentions a really long period of time, or I spend time thinking about, like, the history of the world of Game of Thrones. I don't know. It's just something that kind of annoys me. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you hated the video, please leave a dislike and a comment telling me how to improve. If you really liked the video, then do whatever. I don't really mind. Anyway, y'all, thank you, and I'll see you sometime in the future.